Adams State College. Great stories begin here.
Okay.
Get the lights.
And I'll sit down.
I want to welcome all of you to the lecture that we have tonight. You can see what the title is up on the board there, and there'll be more of an introduction here in just a little bit. With this being first week or month, which is I can't keep track of it.
Coming up.
And anyway, this is a collaborative effort between the Earth Group here at Adams State College and the Field Institute. Field Institute was started about 6 or 7 years ago, and the mission of the Field Institute is to preserve the natural and cultural resources of the San Luis Valley while increasing sustainable economic development in the region. And winter, probably January, February, March, April, maybe in May this year, we'll put on at least 4 winter lecture series, and then we'll have probably 3 or 4 summer tours. So we'll go look at this, look at that, look at something else. And we're going to have a board meeting next week. And I just sent out an email with a draft agenda, and there's 6 or 7 items on there, so we'll probably take some time and have a wrestling match to figure out what we're going to do this summer. It gets a little bit difficult at times. We have partners in this: Rio Grande National Forest, San Luis Valley BLM, Great Sand Dunes National Park and Reserve, San Luis Valley National Wildlife Refuges Complex, Nature Conservancy's Madros Patton Ranch, and the Rio Grande Watershed Conservation Education Agency. The purpose of the Institute is organized for educational and research purposes to promote greater stewardship of natural and cultural resources and to promote related sustainable economic development within the valley. If anybody wants to know more about it, there are brochures here on the table, and you can pick them up. At the present time, we operate under the Rio Grande Watershed Conservation Education Initiative, which is I never have really understood what it is. Too bad Judy isn't here. Rudy Lopez isn't here to tell us. But they're a 501c3 organization, and we operate under their umbrella, and so it works out quite well for us. And Judy is on the board. When it first came in, I might say Bob Kirk. He's one of the board members. And of course, Jared with the college here is one of the board members. But Bob and I decided that we didn't think we needed to have a signing sheet tonight. And since the younger people rule the world today, when I talked to Jared, he said, I think we should. So, anyway, I'm going to pass this around so if you folks should take time and sign in while we appreciate it. So, any questions? Remember, if you want to know more about the Institute, why there are brochures here on the table. Right next to the donation box.
Thank you, Ralph, and thanks to the Colorado Field Institute for co-sponsoring the presentation tonight. The Earth Group is an organization on Adams State campus that was started 3.5 years ago. We're in our, more than 3.5 now. We started with a group of faculty and staff and students, and our goal is really to promote environmental education, environmental action. In fact, the acronym EARTH stands for Environmental Action for Resources, Transportation, and Health. We've instituted a lot of recycling programs on campus. We have a green bike program, a variety of things. And this is our 4th year of having an Earth Week on campus where we try to bring some environmental action and awareness to the community. So thanks again to the Colorado Field Institute, and thank you for coming for the presentation tonight. I should also put in a plug for the last of our Earth Week activities, which is Friday night in this room. We have a series of 3 films, and These films are being co-sponsored by the Earth Group, by the Local Foods Coalition, and by ASC Community Partnerships. So we have a film called Fresh, which deals with food. That will be first. I think Gasland is second, and then Split Estate is the third film. So if you're inclined to come and enjoy some thought-provoking film, please come and join us. But tonight we have a real special treat. Dr. Karel Rogers is a colleague of many of us from a few years ago. Carol has been an administrator, she's been a teacher, she's a researcher, an educator par excellence. When Diana and I first came here in 1989, Carol was the department chair for the biology department. She was at Adams State for 18 years, and in that time she progressed up the ranks from assistant professor through full professor. She was an assistant dean, graduate dean. She was the department chair, and an excellent educator, as any student will tell you. Fair, tough, and really made you learn your material. I'm really proud to be able to call her a colleague of mine. Her research while she was here focused primarily on paleoclimate things. And she also got interested, well, she's always been interested in environmental issues. She got more interested in environmental issues here when she went looking for boreal toads, because she had been told that there was an abundance of toads, of boreal toads, in the surrounding mountains. And when she went looking for them, she couldn't find them. And then she started doing more research on the effects of climate and other issues on the toad population. From Adams State, she left to become a dean at Lake Superior State in Michigan. It's her home state, so she's going back home. And after how many years at Lake Superior State? A couple of years at Lake Superior State, moved down a little farther south to Grand Valley State in Michigan, where she was the chair for quite a number of years, and is now a professor emeritus from Grand Valley State. Again, she's been involved in environmental issues for quite some time, and sustainability issues. Her text, her book, Thinking Green, is available over at the table with her husband. And if you have a chance, you'll really enjoy reading that book. She makes a wide, she is so well read, she incorporates almost everything that she has read in one fashion or another in that book. It is more than an entertaining book. It is a book designed to make you think, and hopefully to make all of us aware of changes that can be made to increase the sustainability of the world in which we live. So, Carol, please, let's welcome our speakers.
Thank you, Marty, and thank you all for being here. It's great seeing familiar faces. It's kind of a two-pronged thing. You know, the familiar faces make you feel good, but it's also a little threatening because it's like, oh man, am I going to blow this? As we were coming into Colorado, I've been gone from Colorado now for 16 and a half years, which I can't believe. I'm not that old. But anyhow, as we came into the east side of Colorado Springs, I just went into shock. I couldn't believe what was there. And then when I got down to the valley, I was looking and I thought, holy cow, these people really probably are not going to appreciate my talk because they aren't experiencing what a lot of the rest of the world is experiencing. And so you can take my talk partly as a warning. It's early enough here that you can protect yourself from a lot of the crap that's going on. And don't mind me with the notes here. It's the only way I can keep my brain in order. I'd like to thank Marty Jones and Diana for hosting potluck tomorrow night, for arranging this talk and doing all that on top of work. Ron and Marilyn Lozer hosting us, for a place to stay, and the college here for allowing us to use this room, and all of you folks for being here. I'd also like to thank my sister Mary Jo Cattleman, who drew the cover of Thinking Green Ethics for a Small Planet. And what that book really is a brain dump of a person who's taught genetics, evolution, environmental ethics, general biology, COBOL programming, a whole bunch of things through the years. And at retirement, it's like your brain just kind of goes, there's all this stuff in there. And so I finished publishing a number of papers and then went at writing and handed this book out to a bunch of friends saying, hey, will you take a look at this and give me some suggestions? And none of them even answered back, right? And so I hired an editor, and this editor helped teach me how to write a book, and I rewrote it, and that's what you have there. And I'll tell you up front, it needs an index and a bibliography, does not have those. I was so sick of this project by the time I got done. I didn't do that. And so if you read it and you find things you want to keep track of, just make notes right in the book, okay? Anyhow, so with that, let's go at this. The thesis of this book is that humans and all of our activities are a part of nature, and we've got the massive social, environmental, economic problems we have today because we have been ignoring nature and how nature functions. And so let me ask you a question. How many of you feel like you're part of nature? Good number of you. Good. How about your car? Is that a part of nature? I mean, natural. Few. All right. And this is part of the issue. That's what we have to do, is draw all our activities in as part of nature, and then we'll do a lot better. So when I taught general bio here at Adams State, where's Hobie, by the way? Anybody knows him? Where's Hobie? Anyhow, give him some crap from me, will you? Anyhow, when I taught general bio here, we'd hit the ecology chapters and we'd talk about tundra and climax vegetation of various kinds. We never categorized humans and human-occupied areas as part of the natural world. We just ignored that. But you can travel around the globe, and as soon as you get to a spot, you can tell whether humans live there. And that's how far we, science and our culture, has pushed ourselves out of the natural world. Frequently in the environmental movement, humans are treated as the enemy, right? If you can keep people out, then things are going to be all right. I think that's wrong, and I think that's fundamental to the problems that we have. So we can ask a couple of questions, and it's, how do we get into this huge mess that we have today? Or why have Americans been so successful at home? Why is our culture spreading so rapidly around the world? I'm going to give you two answers to it, and the first one I'll come back to in a minute. But the first answer is that Americans have been global leaders in all sorts of things because we're so horrendously prosperous. Money talks, right? And it walks. And that is power. And that can overwhelm, say a tribe in the Amazon. Another answer to these questions comes from our perspective worldview that is so common. Worldview is how we make decisions about our everyday lives. And Americans nowadays typically think in what I call an I, me, now worldview. I, me, now worldview is what I want, what I like, what I don't like, you know, and all of that kind of thing. Now, I put these wind turbines on this slide, and the reason is last fall, I was at a talk at the Dominican Center in Grand Rapids on the spirituality of water, and it was a real interesting, lovely talk. And after the talk, some woman, you know, asked a question, and she said she was a person of the land, and so when she walked, views were very important to her, and for that reason, she was opposed to the development of any wind energy on the Great Lakes. And if you think about this, what she was doing is placing her view of what she looked at when she walked above the fact that, you know, our current electric generation facilities, coal-burning plants, are putting mercury into the largest freshwater bodies, you know, on Earth, and CO2 into our atmosphere, and all sorts of negative things. And so, using a time species global perspective on something like should we do A or B or C or D doesn't solve all the problems, but it sure simplifies the discussion. I think things like I don't want my views interrupted really should not be part of the discussion. And so now, since World War II, Americans have been purposefully trained to have, by marketing strategies, to want and need stuff in order to feel worthwhile about ourselves. We've been trained to think first about price, what's the cost of it, rather than about what's the quality of it, is this something that's going to last me for many years, or about whether we need it to begin with, right? There's a wonderful website called thestoryofstuff.com, and what this is just a little black and white stick figures with a woman standing in front of it talking, and it's great. You want to check that website out. Anyhow, part of what she's talking about is a cycle that we get involved in. We go to work, earn money, and once you earn the money, you go home, you're real tired, you watch TV, and TV tells you how you're somehow lacking. That now you need Blu-ray, you need a flat screen TV, you need this new cell phone, you know, whatever it happens to be. And if you don't have this, you're somehow a subnormal person and not very cool. And so then what do? You go out shopping and you buy crap you don't need. And then you're out of money and you go back to work and the cycle goes on. Americans are now obligated to consume to keep the economy healthy. We all know how important the economy is. Just think about this last election that took place. We're obligated to consume also because of the, you know, I lived here 18 years. There is enough oxygen at this elevation in order to breathe. Okay. Keep reminding me of that. All right. Sorry about that. So the structure of our homes also makes us consume in really horrendous ways. Each time any person in this room needs to urinate, there goes 6 gallons of water. And right now, wherever anybody lives, there's 20 to 40 gallons of water sitting there hot. You know, energetically, how inefficient that is. So in case you want to turn on a faucet and get a little bit of hot water. You know, what a dumb idea, right? Also, our infrastructure, the sprawled kind of housing that we have east of Colorado Springs. Here in the valley, things are pretty well condensed. You know, I bought a new car when I lived here, and I didn't put many miles on it, even though I had to keep going to Denver occasionally. Since I moved to where I live now, it's 20 miles to a grocery store every direction, you know? And in the last, since I've lived there, I bet you 150 homes have been built within a half mile of my place, and I thought I was buying a house in the country. You know, this is that kind of infrastructure is just bad news. All you have to do then is build more roads, buy more cars, spend more money buying cars or leasing cars, and so on. We're also, all this keeps the economy growing, but growth can only go so far when it's constrained by national borders. And so you very shortly get to a point where you have to look around the globe in order to get the resources you need to pull off this, I mean now, lifestyle. And so we have essentially developed a set of design rules that we use to produce all this stuff that we need. Our rules are set up by human standards rather than standards of this planet on which we live. We use the cheapest source of raw materials available, and then you leave them with the consumer when you're done with them. You ever try to get rid of an old refrigerator or something, right? We subsidize energy use with fossil fuels like coal and oil, and we all know the repercussions of that. And then you go to industrialized production. You can make one, and that's pretty expensive. But if you make a whole pile of stuff exactly the same, then you get economies of scale, and all of a sudden, you know, you're just mass producing stuff. Well, the mass production naturally has moved over to the food system. It's moved to the clothing system. It's moved to everything under the sun, Henry Ford's idea. And they're all standardized products. And so when you go into Walmart, you essentially have zero choices. You have to make 50 decisions, but it's all spaghetti sauce, right? Simplistic solutions to problems. For example, the use of broad spectrum pesticides that kill everything in their path, including damaging people. So, this brings us to a key philosophical issue. Are humans separate and above the rest of the species on Earth? It's a tough question. It has all sorts of religious and spiritual implications, as well as implications for what we think of ourselves as a species, how we think about what's okay and what's not okay. I have no intention of trying to answer that question, because that's a good move, right? We getting a real fight here tonight. So I'm going to answer it as a biologist. All right? Humans evolved as biological specialists at manipulating their environment to make themselves comfortable in particular places. So around the globe, you get many divergent cultures, for example, Inuit and Kosian and Bantu and, Mongolians and so on, here, there, and everywhere. And each of them have their own food kit, their own clothing, their own types of houses, and so on that were adapted to the materials available to them and kept them as healthy as possible. But right now, with American cultural success, what is going on is the American culture of I, me, now, consumerism is blanketing the globe. People put up pictures of TVs in their grass huts and things like that. I got into a spot in Madagascar where there was no electricity. There was no water, was on the table with a glass over it, and if you wanted water, you took the glass, you poured some water, drank it, and put the cup back on top of this thing. The rest of the world, a lot of it, is very different than what we live, and yet they aspire to being like us, like a boombox and CDs and DVDs, and, all of these things are going in there 90 miles an hour. So American culture with American financial might and American corporations opening markets in countries around the globe. And it can just totally devastate that local culture. Humans are also unique in another way biologically, and that is we're the only species. You probably heard a lot of these. Humans are the only species that and those get blown out of the water right and left, right? Well, this one I don't think will get blown out of the water. Humans are the only species that use symbols of symbols of symbols of symbols to represent meaningful things. For example, money. Originally, between people, there were exchanges of goods that took place, and then they used fancy shells, and then coins were minted, and then paper money, and then checkbooks, and a check represented a transfer of money, and then a credit card. And now we have digital transfers of vast sums of wealth that occur in seconds around the entire globe, right? That's symbol upon symbol upon, and there's no other species that do that. These things do not make us a bad species. We've been misbehaving as a species, but we're smart enough to know that. And we can choose a different way to relate with the rest of the natural world. We're a part of the natural world, and so are cars, because what we do involves visible matter. And that's part of the universe. We have a right to be here and a right to make a living. We don't have a right to cause another major extinction event like is occurring now. We don't have a right to change the Earth's climate that all species rely on. To solve our problems, I think what we need to do is to learn to live within nature's rules. And so as we've seen earlier in this talk, the key issue is that we have not been purposefully designing our activities to follow any of the time-tested rules that have worked on this planet for 4.7 billion years of evolution. We've been doing what's cheapest and easiest for us, and we haven't been living within any kind of a budget in terms of what we consume, including energy, raw materials, food, or consumer goods. We've been like children in a toy shop grabbing whatever we want. In my book, I refer to a story that comes from an organization called Voluntary Simplicity. The guy who wrote it, that particular slick, I can't remember his name right now, but he tells the story of the hummingbird. And what hummingbirds do is go up to flowers and they drink the nectar and get their fill. And when they leave, the flower is benefited, you know, it's pollinated. The hummingbird has gotten what it needs, and all over the globe there are all kinds of wonderful interactions between hummingbirds and beautiful flowers. And anyhow, if it were us right now wanting that nectar out of the flowers, what we would do is pick the flowers, extract the nectar using some toxic substance, cut down all the flower plants, stomp the field, you know, and just literally work it over so that nothing could grow there. And so that's the kind of thing I'm talking about in terms of the kind of change of relationship. And I'm saying it's unethical to continue living the way we have been living, and we need to move to a more ethical way of doing things. Each choice, and the rest of this talk, what I'll be trying to show you is each personal choice is a vote in this great evolving story which is going on Earth. And so each time you buy something, each time you vote, each time you parent a child in a particular way, each time you choose to be employed in a particular spot, you are voting in this great cosmic thing that's going on. So these are nature's organizational rules. Now notice up top, waste equals food. It doesn't say no waste. It's just that the things you don't use, then can feed something else or become part of a cycle that is functioning there in your system. Secondly, nature uses current solar income. It's not using a bunch of stored energy. Energy is, and the chemists in the room, if I slaughter this, energy does a one-way through trip on stuff. You can't, cycle it through anything, but you don't have to waste it. I understand with our current power plants, something like more than 70% of the energy that is released at the power plant is lost before it gets to anybody's home. Third, nature depends on diversity. As a matter of fact, this is the key thing that you want in nature is tons and tons of diversity, not industrial monocrops of exactly the same crap that you can see in store after store after store. And certainly not the same food that is, this corn-based food system that they've set up nowadays. Icky stuff. We'll get back to that. And then nature, it uses real information-rich solutions in industry. I live in an industrial region now, and the mantra is you heat it, you beat it, you treat it, and you can make anything out of whatever you want. And instead, nature, think about how much information is present in DNA. All of our bodies have come from a tiny little egg with an insignificant sperm. Significant, very significant. Anyhow, has come from that interaction between that set of DNA and the environment, and it gives the wealth of diversity that's in this room and all the wonderful people who are here. I put up here the carbon cycle as an example. It runs on the sun's energy all around the world with diverse species. It cycles carbon between living organisms, rocks and soil, and the atmosphere. It uses all kinds of amazing processes like photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Hard to study, but to move the carbon. And so this system is literally a system that has developed through harsh natural selection in which those players that didn't play as well as other players were literally purged from the system. 4.7 billion years of purging out the bad players. So there's no weakness or anything like that in this kind of a system. Nature's rules are enforced by biological evolution. We're all familiar with that. The theory has been expanded and supported by all kinds of fields of study since 1859 with Darwin and the Origin of the Species. And just briefly, biological evolution. Genes control the development and function of whatever organism's body it is. Genes can mutate. They can replicate themselves. Natural selection sorts the variants, and the ones that work best in that time and place then are kept in the gene pool. We're less familiar with the idea that all levels of organization in this world in which we live evolve. Chemical compounds, minerals, cells, cultures, union contracts, economies, economic systems, money. The concept of money has evolved through time. We unconsciously recognize this evolution because we talk about the evolution of language, the evolution of social structures, the evolution of financial instruments, whoever came up with those derivatives. Those evolved off other things, right? Evolution of the universe. Start listening for evolution language as you listen to NPR and other media, and you'll see what I'm talking about. So in all these evolving systems, we have an enforcement mechanism again. And I know this is a lot of theory. We'll get to some easier stuff to deal with here shortly. But now we're talking about agents instead of just genes. Genes are one type of agent, but corporations would be a type of agent also, and certain molecules could be a type of agent. And so we can then use the evolutionary mechanism to explain a lot of the kinds of changes that we see around us every day and in our national kind of setting, state, national, international, and so on. So what goes on here is agents are involved that can replicate themselves physically, like DNA duplication, but it also happens with minerals. Bob, right? He's going, huh, me? Okay. Or by mimicry, so this can happen in cultural, political, or economic agents, and ones of that type, just copying what someone else is doing. Agents can change. You can copy what someone else is doing and then slightly modify it and go forward from there. You can, and then we have selection going on, and this is where the I, me, now perspective comes in big time, because we humans, with our choices, are selective agents in these systems. And so what happens is change occurs in the direction of the most successful agents or groups of agents that band together. Now, of course, success in a particular time and place looks different if you look at it with an I, me, now perspective versus a time, species, global perspective. In other words, you know, what's the big picture on this and what are the implications? A MacArthur Fellow and Professor at the University of Michigan, John Henry Holland, puts things like culture and economy into a category he calls complex adaptive systems, or CASs. This is a relatively new field of study which is part of complex systems and chaos theory. And so let's look at some complex adaptive systems. Each of us live embedded in these different levels of organization, and all of them are complex adaptive systems. The levels rely on levels above and below, and I haven't gone into subatomic particles down here and all that gobbledygook. Molecules and genes, the human body, you know, from the human body, you know, you get a brain, but, you know, the brain and mind aren't necessarily exactly the same thing, right? Mind is probably a lot more than a brain. Social norms come from us together, our minds together interacting. At each level, you get emergent properties occurring. And these emergent properties then can act as agents, selective forces on the agents that are involved in the systems. And so, emergent properties in complex adaptive systems are especially important because they feel like they aren't under our control. I don't know about you guys, but right now, if I look at the U.S. Congress, I think they are not under the control of anybody or anything, right? Or the international economy, it's not under the control of anything. But you get to the bottom line, and yes, they are under the control of something, and it's us as we make our choices. And so here's an example. When we recognize the importance of these nested levels of complex adaptive systems around us, we can start to see that our individual choices control the evolution of many systems simultaneously. We're all familiar with biological evolution associated with pesticide use, as in this illustration. So the the decision to make and use pesticides impacts the genetic constitution of all the species living in this particular area. It also impacts the nitrogen cycle, pollution where the pesticide is applied, as well as where it was made, and that impacts epigenetic effects as genes are passed from one generation to another, all right? And it, which is the control of how genes are going to be expressed in that next generation. It also impacts the atmosphere as well as a whole chain of economic agents. Think about all the different economic things that are involved in the decision to use a pesticide. And it also impacts our social expectations like worm-free apples. I know when I was a kid, you ate around the worm in an apple. And nowadays, I don't think people do that anymore. If you have a worm in an apple, there goes the whole thing. So each purchase you make, each decision you make with respect to your children, each meal you eat, the house you choose to live in, how you spend your free time, are votes in the many levels of complex adaptive systems that are in and around us. Time, species, global impacts occur regardless of the person's worldview. And I mean now person has time, species, and global impacts as they make their choices, right? So let's look at some examples and lighten this up a little bit. So in our near history, the mother of all mutations was when cars were invented and they replaced horses. And so you can see here, as cars replace horses, you get the oil and gas industry, which is controlling whether or not we respond to global warming, right? We get paved roads. Before that, they didn't have paved roads. More petroleum products up there. We get motels because you drive to a motel and then you get bed bugs moving around the globe. Who would have thought, right? You get suburbia, which wouldn't have been possible. You'd spend all your time with your horse going back and forth, and fast food as one of those outcomes. Now, I lived in the San Luis Valley when we got our first McDonald's here, and I remember that day. I remember going to giving a talk at a national meeting, and I said, well, I live 2 hours drive from the nearest McDonald's. And they all went, how could you do that? It's like it was something you couldn't accomplish. And this is like 30 years ago. Well, the concept of McDonald's, fast food, was a mutation, major mutation, in how Americans get and buy food. We're now known around the globe for our fast food. Just like the French are known for their kind of food, ours is McDonald's. Woo. All right, McDonald's started as one tiny restaurant in California with a signature 15-cent hamburger. And it has spread from there to be, or evolved from there to be, a multinational force because of the selective pressure of human choice. McDonald's, in turn, has become a selective force on many human systems. Because we have chosen McDonald's so often, they have impacted our agricultural system. So, for example, the varieties of potatoes that are grown all over the place now are russets, because these make the length and taste of French fry that we prefer most. Also, Tyson chicken raising practices, and I'm sure a lot of you know about that stuff. And what they make out of it is these chicken McNuggets, pre-chewed chicken-like substance, breaded and deep fried. Yum. All right, and then CAFOs and prepackaged foods of all different kinds. Co-evolving with McDonald's were a bunch of other fast food chains. So you got Wendy's and Taco Bell and, you know, you can keep going and going, Hardee's and all of these things. All of these fast food chains are dependent upon industrialized agriculture, where you take the land and chemically treat it, get rid of the worms, get rid of the microorganisms, and replace it with nitrogen fertilizers and pesticides, and literally start extracting corn out of the land as though you're extracting oil out of an oil field. It's essentially what you have to do to support this kind of thing. I highly recommend Michael Pollan's books. Some of you, I know some have read it, like The Omnivore's Dilemma, you know, In Defense of Food and so on. You get this view of the current American food system that will flip your stomach. There are many other aspects of the American culture that have co-evolved with this. Now, at least where we live in Michigan, you have whole families where the children's big choice at dinner time is which fast food restaurant they're going to eat at. All right? And the food is eaten in the car, in the play area, or wherever. A lot of us eat this stuff in the car like we did as we ran out of food as we were coming this direction. This is from a National Geographic article in 2004 asking the question, why are we so fat? The illustration at the left, you can't read the numbers, so I've replicated them up there. And you can see the difference between, I love the 1900 Hershey's candy bar and the 2004, and that isn't the really big ones. Right? And look at the popcorn. Isn't that great? The American mantra now is bigger is better. Much of this is driven by the fast food industry. If you think about it, all they're selling is fat, salt, and grease, right? And so what you got to do is come up with something that will attract people to it. So you use what in birds, when they're incubating an egg, you give them a bigger egg and they sit on it more. So they're using, and this is a super stimulus. And so you take these drink containers and make them big enough that you can almost take a bath in them and fill it with corn, sweetened Coke or whatever. And, you know, people buy that stuff. And what these oversized portions do is drive our agricultural system and drive pesticide production, fertilizer production, drive separation of cows into feedlots because, oh, you haven't got time to mess with using natural fertilizer on the land, and so on, not if you're monocropping, industrializing the processes involved. Well, this drives our obesity rates like mad. It impacts epigenetic effects on genes. There was a recent study in Nature, the journal Nature, in which they found that if fathers with a high-fat diet producing daughter rats, the daughter rats developed a high incidence of diabetes-type symptoms very early in life. All right, and so you get these impacts going through the generations. We also, from obesity, and we're starting to recognize it as a society, recognize that the health care costs, the infrastructure costs, the long-term care costs, and so on, the facility my mother is now in, there is a woman there, she's relatively young, she's horrendously fat, that she can't even take care of herself. She's had the bariatric surgery, but that hasn't stopped the whole thing. The key point here is we have nested levels of complex adaptive systems, and they're all evolving. You know, when you make a choice, it's like dominoes coming down. So, and notice how these complex adaptive systems that we've developed fly in the face of how nature would do things. So what do we do to live in an ethical way? How can we change the direction of the evolution of the systems in which we live? Remember, this is vitally important because American culture is spreading very rapidly around the globe. The Chinese, India, you know, these huge populations are taking on our culture very rapidly. They're taking on our eating habits, our clothing habits, our, you know, you just go through it. So the key issue is money is power. So when you spend your money, be very cautious whose hands you put that money into, right? Every time you put gas in your car, you're putting power into the hands of the gas companies. Right now, that's one of those obligate consumption things we have going on, but I think we can break free from it. If we take a page from natural systems, we would not all choose the same thing. Remember, diversity is the key to what keeps nature abundant and healthy and so on. Diversity between people, and if each of us uses very careful discernment of our needs from our wants, and then we have a bit of very carefully chosen luxury on top of that, that's okay. You know, that's no problem. There's a movement, the voluntary simplicity movement, and you can get involved in this. You just Google voluntary simplicity. Are any of those groups going here in the Valley yet? No? Not, you know. But anyhow, you buy a little book, and groups get together, and they start looking at their lives to see what kinds of unnecessary things they can triage out of their life. When you feel short of time, when you feel short of money, when you feel short of space in your home and so on, voluntary simplicity can help you, or that movement, and it's interaction between people, and not all people do it the same way. Some people want to be one way and other people want to be another way. But the key thing is that people are doing what's most important to them instead of what's most important to keep the economy growing. You may feel like, oh, the problem is too big, it's gone too far, there's no way we can do anything about it. Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book called The Tipping Point, and it's economist. And if you think of any population, there's 100% in it. And whenever you propose anything different, 20% of them are going to say, no, 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 we're not going to do that. But they're all saying no for different reasons. 20% working together, thinking together, can literally change things. When I was at the Earth Summit in Rio, there was a group there that had studied this whole thing. They said the Berlin Wall came down when 20% of the people living near it said, this sucker's got to go. And they just went out there and took it down. You have to recognize there's 60% of people in the middle, and they're not paying attention to anything, right? They'll just do whatever the leaders lead them to. One example of this 20% rule is the Tea Party movement in the U.S. And I don't want to step on anyone's toes, not at all. We attended some meetings. It has only 4 to 6% of the American voting public as hardcore believers. And everyone else is more loosely connected to this whole thing. And look at the difference they made in the last U.S. election. And look at the difference they made in the conversation that's going on in Washington right now. So if Malcolm Gladwell is correct, this means if 20% of us can band together around some fairly simple ideas, then government and our culture will follow. And so just briefly, I want to take a look at some ideas of sorts of things we can band together around. Everyone talks sustainability these days, and there's some definitions of it there. And frankly, I don't particularly like the word. I use it. But The reason I'm not happy with it is think about, you know, like I've got this new husband here, 2 years just last week that we've been married. I'm real glad to have him. I don't want to just sustain my relationship with him or just sustain my relationship with my children and grandchildren. Instead, what I want is an improvement through time, an increased abundance and wealth involved in those relationships. And I think that's the kind of thing we want to shoot for in our relationship with the natural world, or our relationship with ourselves. So I think we can gather around this idea of an abundant future rather than a future that's not that much worse than the present that we're living in. So as we do this, it's not necessary to reinvent wheels, and it's counterproductive to try to go back to how our ancestors lived, the old log cabin that's hot in the summer and cold in the winter. Nah, I think we need to keep our houses at a comfortable temperature. I think we need good health care. I think we need to maintain our standard of living. Is just a question of if we're going to maintain it using a bunch of artificial, you know, compounds that literally don't follow nature's rules. Now I'm going to give you a couple of examples of corporations that have taken on these kinds of ideas, and one is Interface. They're carpet makers. Carpets are wonderful things, right? But there's this nasty, ugly stain over here on this carpet. And what that means is if that won't shampoo out, what you have to do is take all these chairs and tables and everything out of this room, and then you roll all this carpet up and it goes to the garbage, right? Well, what Interface does is makes carpet squares. These things are made out of polylactic acid, which is a corn product. That's not very good. Using corn, but it's a lot better than using petroleum. And the squares are made in such a way that, you know, they carpet a space, and if you get an ugly stain like that, you can come in the middle of the night, pull up a couple of those squares, they take them back to their factory and remanufacture them into more carpet squares. This is a waste as food kind of thing. You're feeding that process instead of the one-way through trip to the trash. And so just think in your home, when the pathways get worn, if you could just go through and fix the spots that look ugly, wouldn't that be nice? All right, and here is another example. And this is a diversity issue and also a waste as food. Currently, I think we're doing a whole lot of warehousing our poor people in urban centers and in rural south of the U.S. and literally treating them as waste and trying to control how much damage they do. Here is Cascade Engineering, and they're an injection mold plastics company, and one of their neat products is a wind generator that's for single household use. It costs about $7,000 with everything you need installed. That sounds like it might be a good idea here in the San Luis Valley with all your wind, right? So Fred Keller, their CEO, has a real soft spot for the urban poor and prisoners, or, you know, convicts and so on. And so he has focused on the cycle of poverty that takes place in inner cities. And what he does is he hires ex-cons, he hires people in poverty, and he recognizes that they have a problem much larger than just lack of money. The problem is not knowing how to do a bunch of different things. So he hires social workers to work with him, and the whole tone of the workplace is supportive. And in short order, he has this army of the most loyal workers you ever saw in your life. I've worked with people from Cascade Engineering, and they just love going to work every day because they are part of solutions. Another idea that is very important, and this goes to the question of diversity versus monopolies. Right now, we're in this big thing of globalization, and we're doing it with transnational monopolies, the monoculture version of globalization. And we have to get rid of that. We have to go to a diversity kind of globalization, cooperation and collaboration between agents in various places in the world. So here in the San Luis Valley, you can't raise coffee, and yet you need coffee. And instead of using a transnational corporation like Maxwell House and so on to get this coffee to you, you collaborate through the internet with some people locally, and these transnationals then can't scoop all the profit out of the middle. Globalization is a fine thing to happen, but we have to do it in a way where it's little entities collaborating with one another rather than having these mega corporations. There's a lot of them that have GNPs greater than most nations on earth. Yeah, and you can't have that kind of thing. I listened to a guy by the name of Raj Patel speak in Grand Rapids, and he's mainly into farming. And he said, globally, what's going on now with farmers is like an hourglass. At one end of the hourglass are tons of farmers all over the earth, and they're all having to raise corn or whatever in a particular way. And then at the other end of the spectrum are millions of consumers who are eating these products, and in between 6 to 8 corporations, many of them privately held, who control both ends of this spectrum. We can't have it like that. So globalization, collaboration between equal partners rather than extraction of resources from one place or another, and using cheap labor here and using the money of and the debt potential of Americans to soak up the crap you've produced. We also have to cooperate and collaborate at a local level in order to ensure prosperity. And I've been talking with people, and it doesn't sound like you have a whole lot of artisan stuff going on around. You have some, and I noticed nice shops downtown. So I just looked up a little bit. If each of us frees our time from the treadmill of consumption and look at ourselves and say, what have I got to offer that I can make and trade with somebody near me? And all of a sudden, as you consume, what you're doing is providing work for your neighbor and things that can be used in trade and so on. So as you do it also, you're taking power and money out of the hands of the big guys, and you're putting it in the hands of your neighbors. And so you're keeping your local economy strong. Key issue is just avoid industrial supply chain kinds of solutions to things. I think there's tremendous potential here in the valley for grass-fed beef, which goes for a real premium, and your health would be so much better if you're all eating that. Also, I noticed this. If anyone's looking for a job, in Colorado, the James Ranch Artisan Cheese is looking for a dairy cheese apprentice. Can you imagine having someone around here who is making artisan cheese, goat cheese? Have you ever had homemade goat cheese?
It's right on the tabletop.
Oh, cool. Who's making it here? Wonderful. If I'd known, I'd have put it. Good. All right, that's cool. Cheese making, bread making, clothing, textiles, just all kinds of stuff is possible. And then once you've got artisans, you want to be supporting the local artisans. Now, this is from the West Michigan region, but what the artisans have done is gotten together, and you can just go on the internet and order fresh food, locally grown food, delivered to your house each week. All right? And all of those artisans are listed on this website, so you can go to the individual artisans or you can do it through the website. I would think in the San Luis Valley would be a great job for somebody to find all those artisans and, you know, help band together. All right, themes are now in my book. I've given so much detail, 30-some years of crap out of my mind, right? All right, and so anyhow, the themes that are there is local, innovative, collaborative, non-extractive kinds of solution, knowing that we do have control over our future and that we have the power we need because money is power. And the key place it ultimately comes from is us, the citizens of this country. We can live healthy lives, higher quality lives, less stressful lives, if we're willing to think in a time-species global way about what we choose. And that's artisan and local versus centrally supplied industrial monocrop kind of things. We can have an abundant life if we'll just learn to live within nature's rules. And what we have at stake, I'm a paleontologist, right? And so you look at time in terms of geologic history. So humans can either continue to be a part of the geologic history on this planet or be another, oh, damn, didn't work this time either, right? And our individual votes count as this story is being written. Thank you. I'm sorry, I tried to make it shorter than this. Are there some questions? Oh, yes, please.
Thank you for your presentation. One of the first questions that pops into my mind is, do you ever discuss population control as part of your presentation? Is that part of what you considered?
You know, there for a while, I thought the whole problem we have with the environment is this rapid reproduction of people. And then I went to the Earth Summit and I had this amazing conversation with a Brazilian woman who spoke Portuguese, and I only had some Latin, and you know, we did a lot of gesturing and so on. And what she got me to understand is that, and it goes back to Paul Ehrlich and the population bomb and so on, you know, the impact that we have on Earth and on one another has a whole lot to do, not just with the number of people, that's a multiplier on it, but it's also how rich we live, how much stuff we throw away, how resource intensive, what technologies we use. You know, when you're transporting, well, you can eat these lush meals coming out of your garden or from fairly local places and not do much damage. But if you're eating the food out of Mexico or out of Brazil and the local people there have no food, you know, the impact of that is greatly magnified. Number of people, yeah. When I've been in various places, it's just like, God, there's a lot of people. You know, how do you get away from them? This is just awful. But you realize you can stand all the people on Earth. You know, we're going to hit 7 billion this year. You can stand them all in the state of Texas, and they'd each have 4 square feet. They wouldn't be very happy. But that's not a lot of people. So it's what we're doing rather than, you know, for houses, we're more like hobbit houses, right? Heated and cooled with the earth rather than you know, coming in there and putting in these big mausoleum kind of thing. You know, so it's how we go about it is,
so yes? I think that's more important. That lifestyle is more important than numbers.
I think if we're going to survive as a species, we cannot continue using the technological kit we're currently using, because population has a momentum associated with it. So, you know, if you have populations like this, all right, and take China, for example. So they instituted a one-child policy, and what that did is added this amount of people to their population that next generation, and these were the ones dying, right? So you see the problem, a population is going to keep growing even when you really curtail reproduction. And so it's a nasty problem. Had we addressed it in the 70s, we'd be in a lot better spot now. But even if we had addressed it in the 70s, I think we would have had to start changing this culture of consumption and the kinds of technologies we're willing to use, all these toxins, the industrial agriculture, you know, the mountaintop mining for coal, the fracking for natural gas. You know, there's a bunch of crap we're doing that we just can't do.
Along the same lines, what do you think of the idea of the human species moving off planet to avoid the next extinction level event?
How do we get this screen up? You just pull it? No. When I worked at Adams State, you pulled on the screen, it went up, you know. Oh, yeah, okay. And then let's click off that. All right, so exponential growth, right? So here we have a bottle of bacteria, all right, and there are a couple of happy little bacteria in here, all right? And these bacteria double every minute, all right? And so, and let's say that at midnight, that's the wrong way, this is noon and midnight. All right, so let's say, you know, they're doubling every minute, all right? At what time is this bottle going to be half full? 12:59 or 11:59. Right? And what time is it quarter full? It's obvious, right? Right, and it just, you know, because it's completely full at midnight. And so as long as our population is growing, you can't solve this problem. Let's say they go out and find 3 new bottles for these bacteria to live in. At what time are those bottles full? Yeah. I mean, it's just a horror story. You've got to, you know, curb that population growth if you're ever going to solve.
Smart enough to limit their population, but nature, who backs last, will.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
But I'm also saying that we've exceeded carrying capacity given the kinds of technologies and systems we're currently using. If you change those technologies and systems so that what you're doing increases the fertility of the land, you know, like the hummingbird, pretty quick, your carrying capacity is much different.
Where has more than a couple % of the population made a change?
That's where we all come in, working toward this 20.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you'd be surprised.
Population to your talk.
You'd be surprised in West Michigan. I was president of the board for this thing called the West Michigan Environmental Action Council, and it acted as kind of a seed spot to start new tax-exempt organizations and different organizations. And one of the things that WINEAC started was a sustainable business forum. Has over 100 businesses in it, including Steelcase, Amway Corporation, Altacor, Hayworth, Herman Miller, and so on. And as those businesses start thinking about what are nature's rules, how can we function within nature's rules, and how can we be a part of the community that we're in, all of a sudden you get a change that occurs very, very rapidly. And so business people around the globe are starting to recognize that what they're doing, well, they've got grandkids, and they're saying, what I'm doing to my grandkids is not moral, it's not ethical, and therefore I'm changing how this business functions. And so Ford cars now have seat material that if you're done with it, you can take it out and compost it. And the worms can eat it, it won't hurt them. Used to be, they used a material that was so toxic that it was illegal to even throw any of it away in France. Right? And that was what was on airplane seats that we all have to sit on, right? When we go. Yeah. But I hear you, what you're saying. It's kind of, there is no hope. But if we buy into there is no hope, and I've been there, believe me, if you buy into that, you don't come out with ideas, right? You know, it's time to start collaborating. It's time to start getting these networks going. And you're in such a good spot here in the San Luis Valley because you've fended off the water people, so you're not going to be wiped out in terms of your water.
Huh?
Unless the
Might need more water.
frackers get to it.
Who?
Unless fracking might affect the water.
That isn't in the geology here, is it?
Yes, it is.
It is?
Natural gas.
Ah, yeah. But, you know, banding together the way the Valley people banded together to keep the Canadians from pulling the water out of here, and that's local community. The stronger you make your local community, allowing for diversity, you know, with a big goal like increasing the abundance for the future, right?
Let's take one or two more questions.
I'm Ted McNeil Smith, and for many years I sat back on the back row, and I got annoyed by people in the front row would say, I have a question. So I'm going to address all of you. I have two, I think, good news things to say. One is that here in the Valley, I know of two people that raise organic cattle, well, three couples actually. In Saguache County, George Whitten, and in Alamosa County, his partner, the Kressingers, where they raise organic cattle, that I talked to Julie Sutherland, George's wife, and she said she got a thing when they got certified as USDA organic cattle, that their hamburger meat has less fat and cholesterol in it than chicken breasts, which I found very interesting. And the McNeils over in Rio Grande County also grew organic cattle. The other good news is that about a month ago, I saw in the news that Subway overtook McDonald's as the largest chain food place. And while Subway sells some stuff that isn't fairly healthy, it's a hell of a lot better than McDonald's, which is admittedly trying to do a little more healthy stuff.
Thank you. But the key there is that bit of information, take it and magnify it. You know, all of you will be much healthier if you're eating those people's meat. And if you think about how much that increases their prosperity, and all of a sudden it becomes the thing to do, that's what's popular, and people pay a premium for, and soon, you know, you realize that organic, grass-fed, that kind of food is growing very rapidly in demand. Industrial agriculture's products have been flat, and so what they're trying to do is do a quick about face and industrialize locally grown, organic, and so on, but they can't do it, right? Not in a strong community. Is there another question, or have we just had enough of this?
I'm curious whether the small local artisan, et cetera, if that kind of a setup can sustain the society that we have.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. You don't have to isolate yourself from, the resources that are out there in the big world. What you're doing is just steering power away from those who would run. What was that phrase you used today about the people?
Who assert ownership of the commons and feel free to take exclusive use of it to the detriment of all the rest of us. So whether you're polluting water or polluting air, they've asserted ownership. They don't own it.
Or asserted ownership over the food production system or the, you name it, system. And we all tithe money to them constantly. And what you got to do, steer that money away from them, right? And support your neighbor, and yeah, you can sustain. As a matter of fact, when things happen like this stupid meltdown in 2008, your economy will sit there and your economy will go, it's a little tremor off in the distance. It doesn't wipe us out. Right? So, a lot to be gained. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your attention.
Adams State College. Great stories begin here.